Hello, we're Natalie and Abby, and you are listening to The Sensational Life with Bibic.
Join us to explore the many layers of life through unique and inspiring topics each week.
Bibic is a national charity dedicated to empowering children and young adults with brain injuries, disabilities, and neurological or developmental challenges. We're both part of a fantastic team of developmental therapists.
There may be times we cover some difficult topics during this podcast, but we will always give you prior warning of this. We'll have some wonderful guest speakers joining us, and we can't wait to hear from you with all your questions and your own stories. Together, we can create a more inclusive and understanding world, one episode at a time. Hello and welcome back to the Sensational Life with Bibic podcast. We are back with another special. We're really excited about this one. I think we're excited for all our specials, actually.
We're excited about a lot of things, to be honest, but this one in particular was just so interesting. We've just come off recording. We've been recording for about 2 hours.
2 silent hours, I would like to say.
Silent hours where Natalie and I forgot that we were on a podcast and needed to talk.
Yeah. Which is unusual for us, and I think we keep noticing that when we do these specials that actually we have the ability not to talk. We do just want to give everyone a bit of a trigger warning when it comes to this podcast. We do talk about some difficult topics, and I'm just going to list some of those topics now for you guys. So just so you know, we're just going to talk about what those topics include. So if you do have any young listeners listening, it might be worth just quieting it down and listening to yourself just to double check that you're happy for them to hear it. But today's podcast, if you notice from the title, we're talking about trauma and executive function and the crossover between and how it can have that impact. We've got the wonderful Victoria joining us, who knows a lot about trauma in terms of her background. So she works with people that have experienced sort of sexual abuse or rape, and she talks about sort of domestic violence. We do also talk about some of the adverse effects of trauma, which can mean that people have suicidal thoughts. So it's just to let you guys know that we do talk about some difficult topics. We have split this into 2 episodes. So we have 1 episode on our core information, and then we also got 1 episode on strategies. But Victoria does signpost us to lots of great places at the end of the strategies episode. But also it's just to remind everyone that we do have our SAL line, which you can get in contact with. There's lots of charities out there like Mind that also will be able to support. So it's just to make sure that everyone's comfortable, happy listening. I know me and Abby said we're excited. I think it comes from the fact that we just love learning, and we really like topics like this because it gives us an opportunity.
But it is quite a heavy topic, and Natalie's already signposted some places, and our guest Victoria will also signpost some places, but we'll try and put those in the description and the comments so that you can access them after if you feel that you need to.
But without further ado, we will pass it over to Victoria, and we really hope you enjoy the knowledge that she comes to us with, because it's just, she's just amazing, and she's really deepened our knowledge, and just the things that she talks about is brilliant. So we'll hope you enjoy it.
Okay, so we've got the lovely Victoria with us this morning. Hello, Victoria. Thank you for coming to talk to us today.
Hello, good morning. It's amazing to be here today. I'm really excited.
As are we. Could you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and what your role is, please?
Yeah, so I have been a counsellor for a charity called Somerset and Avon Rape and Sexual Abuse Support, so more kind of commonly known as SARSAS, for about 4 years. And prior to that, worked for the same charity, but as a specialist support worker. So in total, I've been there about 9 years or so, with a couple of breaks to have my 2 lovely children as well. So my role now, currently as a counsellor, is to support adult survivors of rape and sexual abuse, which might have occurred at any point in their lives, to offer them a safe place to process the trauma and hopefully empower them by giving them the tools they need to begin to heal. And then more recently, I finished a year's training on somatic trauma therapy, which I finished in February, which is very much based on the idea that trauma affects the whole body, not just the brain. So that's kind of equipped me with a bunch of new skills and more knowledge for my current role, but also personally as well, which has been great.
I bet that's really interesting. That sounds really interesting as well, like how it affects the whole body, definitely.
Yeah, definitely. I think it was, and it was completely new for me, I think. I mean, I kind of knew it did to a certain extent, but this has kind of just opened up so much. And I mean, that's a lot of what I'll kind of talk about today, which I find fascinating. So hopefully
I'm like edge of my seat, like I'm gonna learn so much.
well, hopefully everyone else finds it as fascinating as I do as well. So, and then kind of prior to working at SARSAS, I worked at victim support as part of a restorative justice project with the youth offending team. And I've also worked in resettlement within a prison. So I've had quite a lot of varied roles, which I love. And that's obviously given me all the kind of experience as well that, all those roles have brought me, which has been kind of fantastic. So, and I think I've just learnt so much from the people that I've worked with as well. So I'm really grateful for those kind of opportunities. And then I guess on a more personal kind of level, I live with my husband and I live with two beautiful but incredibly lively boys who are 5 and 2.5, and our wonderful dog Waffles as well, who kind of, I think, puts up with a lot from the two
Love the name.
young children. Sometimes I think he might want to move out, but he does get a lot of fuss, especially from the younger one. And to be fair, my husband will probably say that he puts up with a lot with all of us as well. So I mean, life is like really hectic, can be quite stressful. So self-care has really, certainly over the last couple of years, become a necessity rather than a luxury, which is sort of part of what I want to get across today as well, for my physical and my mental health. So, my outlet personally would be kind of going to the gym or going for a power walk or a jog, which is like even better at this time of year, isn't it, with that kind of sun shining more often. And I also love to kind of switch off in the evening for an hour or so and watch anything kind of crime or drama related and snuggle under the blanket and cuddle the dog. So and just love getting out for like family days, whether that's kind of national trust places or trips to the beach or family walks or whatever. So so I guess that is kind of me in a nutshell.
I was going to say, you're singing to Abby's tune there, aren't you, with the crime documentary?
Love a crime documentary. I mean, so many people do though, don't they?
No.
So many people do.
It's not a relaxing program to watch.
No, not at all. No, it's not. No, there's something about it, isn't it? I'd actually love to know the psychology around that, because so many people like I speak to love that.
Yeah.
So there must be something going on there.
And would you give us some sort of give us an overview on like how trauma affects the body? Not affects the body, sort of affects person's sort of daily activities and things like that. Because I feel like the word trauma, and I don't know if it's my own personal views, but I feel like the word trauma has often got a lot of stigma attached to it. Because I think we always go straight to people, don't we, that have got sort of PTSD or things like that, because it can have quite an impact on everyone depending on how they've reacted to certain things. So would you give us a bit of an overview on sort of how it can affect a person's daily activities?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it might be helpful to kind of clarify kind of what trauma is and what it means, as you kind of alluded to there, Natalie. So a traumatic event is something that's abnormal, it's distressing, it's unpredictable, and usually kind of involves, a serious threat to life. But it is, however, the long-lasting response, both emotionally and physically, that overwhelms a person and their capacity to cope with the aftermath of the event and therefore the subsequent daily activities. And it is worth remembering here that people process experiences differently. So not everyone is going to have the same reaction to an event what one person experiences as trauma may not cause as much distress for another person. So, and in terms of kind of trauma affecting the body, I think this is really key to mention, because it doesn't just affect someone emotionally, it does affect them physically as well. And trauma can kind of quite literally become trapped in your body. And there's a YouTube clip actually that you can watch. So anyone can kind of Google this, of an impala escaping death and then shaking off the stress, the trauma.
Oh wow.
So it's amazing to watch actually. So in the clip, the impala's sort of threat response has been to flop, so to play dead essentially. And then luckily for the impala, the cheetah then kind of loses interest or is spooked in some way and flees. So after a few moments, the impala's breathing starts to get heavier. So you can see that it goes from very shallow to pretty much non-existent to then getting heavier. And then it starts to make some jerky movements. So it is literally shaking off the trauma, and then it casually gets up and kind of runs away, and it's quite amazing to watch. But obviously as humans, our brains are obviously more developed, and therefore kind of our response to threat more often than not tends to be to freeze, especially when it does come to trauma such as sexual and domestic abuse. And that response works wonderfully well, and it does help us to survive. However, unlike the impala, we don't tend to shake the trauma off. Therefore, it becomes kind of thwarted and trapped energy within our bodies. And then that can be further compounded if a person is unable to speak to a trusted person about the trauma, which, might be for a whole multitude of reasons. And I think it's important to kind of mention here that we're not in charge of what threat response our brains choose. It happens in a split second, and the brain will do whatever it needs to do to lead to the best outcome, which is surviving. It's incredibly rare that the fight or flight response would be implemented in a situation that involves violence or abuse. The most common response is around, I think it's around 75%, I read somewhere, is to freeze. And there is also a flop response, which might look like fainting or collapsing, and the fawn response, which is to kind of placate or appease the perpetrator, which would be like obviously really common in a domestic abuse situation or something. But then kind of going back to the physical health kind of implications of trauma, because that trauma becomes trapped in our autonomic nervous system, which I will speak more about later, physical conditions such as things like fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, autoimmune diseases, and even IBS, migraines and frequent earaches can be a result of trauma manifesting in the body. And people can even get non-epileptic seizures as well due to trauma. I've actually come across that a fair bit in my work. So physically, the impact potentially can be huge. But other than sort of going more onto sort of the daily activities side, other than someone's kind of physical health, being affected, I mean, my goodness, there's just so many things. A person's sense of self is shattered. They lose part of themselves, their identity. They no longer feel safe. They lose trust in those around them, and they can carry a huge burden of shame, even though, it obviously isn't their fault. They'll be struggling to make sense of the traumatic events, and there's often self-blame that sits alongside in a bid to exert some sort of control over the situation. Trauma, leaves someone feeling helpless, powerless, out of control. And they are, simply like awful feelings to have, and to feel actually really alone with those feelings as well. So a person might experience flashbacks, nightmares, body memories, which are those physical kind of visceral memories, dissociation, intrusive thoughts, hypervigilance, overwhelm, anxiety, anger, panic, numbness, depression. I mean, the list kind of goes on really. And of course, some people will go on to develop PTSD and complex PTSD as well. So, in terms of daily activities, thinking all of those things that someone's got to be coping with, it will impact people's ability to leave the house. They might want to avoid certain triggers. It affects their ability to look after themselves, not being able to wash, dress, eat. People may have trouble concentrating. They may struggle at work and have to take time off. There's often sleep disturbances, of some sort, and whether that's nightmares or just simply just not being able to sleep, which of course then is going to heighten emotion and make you feel worse. People will often become quite withdrawn and isolate themselves as they can't cope to any sort of connection to other people. It might affect their relationship with their partner. They might not want to meet up with friends. It really takes quite a lot of energy to hide the trauma. And if friends and family do know, quite often the person feels they don't truly kind of understand. They might lose interest and enjoyment in hobbies that they previously used to pursue for relaxation. And then, you will get, some people might turn to numbing agents. So whether that's alcohol, drugs, self-injury, disorders, eating, they may even have suicidal thoughts. So it's really all encompassing, and it can completely turn people's lives upside down, as well as their friends and family's lives as well. There is a huge ripple effect, because it affects all facets of a person's life potentially.
And I
I was
think
going to ask that actually. Sorry,
no,
Natalie.
you don't. We're not in the same room, Abby. We'll work with it.
I was going to say, can the trauma that one person experiences, so going back to kind of like that domestic abuse side of things, if that's witnessed by children, because you've heard in, years gone past, oh, they were so small, we probably won't remember that because they're only, 2, 3, that sort of age. Can you see that would impact, or do you see that impact in adults when they've grown up, that they've witnessed this traumatic event?
Oh yeah, absolutely, hugely. I think that's one of the ACEs, isn't it? The adverse childhood experiences is witnessing abuse, violence, domestic abuse. Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And often, when I do work with clients, I mean, obviously they have kind of come because they've been affected in some way by sexual violence, but more often than not, that does come with other traumas as well. And one of those is, childhood kind of experiences. But oh my goodness, yes, because I think even if the child is young, even if they're, I don't know, 2 or something, they might not understand what's going on. They might even not necessarily have the cognitive kind of memory to it, but it might be that they genuinely feel, in that moment when they were 2, that made them feel really anxious potentially, or panicked or frightened, I would imagine, or fearful. Now they can remember that. Their body will remember that. So even if their memory, if they haven't got that in their memory, then their bodies can. And that's, I mean, that's scary, isn't it? But that's how powerful, your bodies are.
And I think that's why it's so important to have these conversations, because as part of our assessments at Bibic, so we class ourselves as trauma informed because we've done a lot of training on sort of trauma. And we're not to say we're trauma experts, but we like to ensure that families have the opportunity to discuss these things in a sort of safe environment, because especially, and I think this is why this conversation is so great, because especially when it comes to executive functioning and the sensory system, and you think how much all of those things have an impact on the way that we live. It's so, I think you going through that list, it just made me it clicked in my head. It was like, God, this is so encompassment. This is on every aspect of our bodies. It's just, it seemed really major.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you don't then, as a child or even as an adult, you don't talk about what you've been through and those experiences, then that does further compound that kind of trapped energy that I was talking about, because you're not even able to kind of release that verbally either.
So going sort of on to sort of executive functioning, sort of how does trauma impact a person's ability to manage their executive function? So things like their memory, their attention, their decision making. So what impact can that have on it?
So as we've kind of talked about, there is so much that potentially goes on for a person after experiencing trauma. And the increase in stress hormones can impair a person's cognitive function. The brain and just our whole system is completely overwhelmed, and it has reduced capacity to manage the key executive functions, which are managed by the prefrontal cortex, so the front part of the brain. So aspects such as attention and focus, decision making, planning, adapting, organizing and managing tasks, they just no longer become the brain's priority. Instead, the back part of the brain is activated and goes into a survival mode, which prioritizes day-to-day survival needs, really, over other functions. And also, trauma can physically alter the way our brain develops and the neural connective pathways. And these kind of neurological disruptions impact the development and functioning of the brain's regions responsible for executive functionings, particularly the prefrontal cortex. So this would be particularly prevalent with childhood trauma, thinking about the development of their brains.
Yeah, because this is obviously where, because we see a lot as well, the correlation between ADHD and trauma, because is that where that comes from, sort of the potential changes that it comes with our executive function, impulsivity, decision making? Is that where you can see those commonalities within ADHD?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you probably know more about, the link between trauma and kind of ADHD than I do. But I think, I think we have to consider that, don't we? I mean, there's so much development going on. So if that development is then interrupted by, for instance, using your example, Abby, of kind of witnessing domestic abuse, then it makes total sense, doesn't it? But I mean, it's an area I really want to do more research on, because I mean, it's very kind of complex. I mean, it's fascinating, and I only kind of know the basics of it, really.
Yeah.
But I mean, in terms of memory, I can kind of explain, a little bit more about that and how trauma can affect a person's memory. So our hippocampus, which is part of the limbic system, is responsible for processing our memories, and it essentially facilitates a transfer of information from short-term to long-term memory. And so I like to think of the hippocampus as a library, and a normal day-to-day memory is date and time stamped. The new memory is processed, and then it's kind of put on a bookshelf, which is the analogy for the long-term memory. So for the most part, then a person can retrieve this memory when they want to. The hippocampus is really sensitive to the effects of stress hormones such as cortisol. So prolonged exposure to high levels of these hormones can lead to the withering neurons, essentially, in the hippocampus, which potentially then contributes to memory loss and also emotional regulation difficulties as well. The hippocampus doesn't work well when the amygdala is activated, which is the alarm center of the brain, the part that signals that stress hormone and threat response. The trauma memories then aren't processed, and the amygdala stores them somatically, so within the body. And this is why people can have what are called body memories after the trauma. And it's also why people who have experienced trauma might have fragmented, limited, or even no memories of events. And the memories can resurface in the form of flashbacks, sometimes many, many years later, giving the experience that the trauma is happening now. They're literally reliving that trauma. People experience these body memories, these visceral kind of physical sensations within their body, as well as emotions they felt at the time of the trauma. And so through safe processing in counselling, those trauma memories can be brought into the working short-term memory, and then they can be date stamped and then stored in the long-term memory via the hippocampus. It's there's so much research in this area, so as I say, and it's I find it really interesting.
You've done it again. Me and Abby have gone quiet.
Yeah. Wow.
It's just so, like, I think it's such a difficult topic, but I think it's just I think I've said it again, and I don't know if you agree, Abby, but for me, I feel like it's like how much it impacts. And I think people don't always realize the severity of the impact of trauma. And I think, I don't know if you've sort of experienced in assessments, Abby, that like trying to explain that to families or trying to sort of work through that with families, like, yeah.
It's tricky to get them to understand. Like you were talking, Victoria, and I was taking it back to a very basic level when you were talking about it affecting the memory. And I was thinking about when I did like GCSEs, even though you do all that cramming and revision, you get into the high stress situation, which is only for an hour, 2 hours maximum, isn't it? So it's not
Yeah.
long-term stress like trauma would cause. But you get into that exam and it's really difficult to access those memories if you're in that high stress situation. That just kind of, I think, gives you that little glimpse into actually that's, although it's important to GCSEs, that's an hour of your time, whereas if this is impacting your daily life,
Yeah.
that's going to have that significant impact on how you can access those memories and moving forward. And
Yeah, I think that's a really good example, actually. Yeah, really good example. Because of course, yeah, the stress response is fully implemented in exams,
yeah,
isn't it? But yeah, it is that classic. Oh my goodness, yeah,
yeah,
I've done the revision, but
yeah,
actually everything goes out of your head. And
yeah,
yeah, absolutely. And that's just for that situation, as
yeah.
you say. So yeah, I think that's actually a really good kind of almost kind of day-to-day kind of example, especially for young people
I
to
think
relate
also
to.
I think for me, realizing as well, like you can understand why people feel so much guilt when it comes to trauma, because there's an element of, I don't know if it's guilt or sort of worry or embarrassment, but because it has such an impact and they then reliving it and potentially having these flashbacks. And I think sometimes when I've talked to families or I've talked to parents about sort of things that maybe they've experienced or even sort of the child experience, it seems to still be that, well, this shouldn't have this much impact on me, or it shouldn't still be there, or I shouldn't still be thinking about it. I
Yeah.
think that sometimes is quite a difficult topic because, like you said at the beginning, it's just how the brain has responded in that moment to that event, whether the person themselves sees that it should or shouldn't have impacted them. It's just how the brain has worked. So actually that guilt and that worry and that shame of I keep thinking about it and I shouldn't, I think that can be quite tricky too.
Definitely, there's a huge amount of shame, and that is one of the most difficult feelings to kind of deal with, because it kind of just sits. And it just gets kind of bigger and bigger the more you don't talk about it. Trauma doesn't necessarily have to be the sexual abuse, the domestic abuse, all those classic things that we think of, bereavement, car accident things. I mean, I think something that is really traumatic is kind of bullying, and that doesn't have to be a huge amount, and it's amazing how many people don't really, in my experience, kind of really recognize that was trauma, because I have these trauma cards at work, and it's just quite a nice sort of visual representation of kind of the impact of trauma and things, especially if kind of a client's not too sure kind of where to start with the counselling. And some of those are, there are cards that say the types of trauma, and we'll often kind of go through those, and there is kind of that sort of realization, like, oh my goodness, I've picked 10 of those cards. I never would have thought that I'd been through kind of that much trauma, and even societal trauma, like we all went through that with the pandemic.
Yeah,
No matter our experience of it, obviously, for some it would have been a lot worse than for others, but no matter, we probably all hold our own trauma in some way, even if that looks very different for each of us. So it doesn't have to be those kind of, the car accident or house fire or being mugged, or, it doesn't have to be those at all. It's, and I think as well, if it's sort of prolonged and sustained, it can be sort of lots of horrible comments building up over time, and that's just going to build and build.
And I think also from the neurodiversity side of things, like we often experience children that really struggle, say in school, and it might not be through the school's fault, but it might be sort of that transition into school and things like that. I know I've worked with a family where the individual had some experiences where they became very, very distressed at school and they sort of tried to escape and things like that. Sometimes that can have that, because again, like you said earlier, it's knocking the brain into that fight, flight, the survival mode, and potentially sometimes it's not to say every child that's experienced that may have experienced trauma, but it's to say that potentially some of them actually that's had that same effect.
Oh my goodness, yes, definitely. Because I guess, and if his child doesn't want to go to school, sort of neurodiverse or not, that means that they don't feel safe in some way. That means they are going into an environment and we might not know exactly why, but there is something about that where they don't feel safe. And if you don't feel safe, that potentially is sort of activating that trauma, isn't it? So yeah, absolutely. And I think, on the neurodiversity aspect, it's that not being understood, really, and signs of those neurodiverse elements maybe not being picked up until later as well. So yeah, I think there can be a huge amount of trauma around that.
What are some of the common signs that someone's executive functioning is being affected by past trauma?
So you might notice that a person is being more impulsive than usual. They have difficulty with their memory, as we've kind of talked about, or attention. They withdraw and become socially isolated. They aren't able to carry out basic tasks that they used to be able to. Perhaps they used to be a really organised person and then they've become quite chaotic. They might forget or kind of struggle to keep appointments or meet up with friends, and their thoughts or patterns of behaviour might become quite rigid, and there'll definitely be less of an ability to regulate their emotions. So actually thinking about that, it probably mirrors quite a lot actually in terms of kind of neurodiversity, doesn't it? And neurodevelopmental conditions mirrors an awful lot, which again can be quite tricky, can't it?
Yeah.
So, and then in terms of kind of, I think it might be helpful to kind of talk about emotional regulation a little bit more, and nervous system regulation as well, because it is such an integral part of trauma counselling and kind of working with trauma. And I know that you both spoke about Dan Siegel's flipping of the lid in another episode.
Yeah. Oh, we do have an avid listener.
Do you know what? I really am. I've listened to every episode.
I was gonna. It's so hard, Nick, because it's a really difficult topic. But at some point, I was thinking I might plug that people should go back and listen to our previous episodes, because this is going to be so helpful, especially if they sort of either listen to this first and then go back, or if they listen to our previous episodes and then listen to this, because it's just so interesting how it all sort of crosses over and things like that.
Links up, yeah, definitely. You've spoken about the flipping of the lid, but basically, yeah, so when the prefrontal cortex, the logical and thinking part of the brain, and then the reptilian emotional part of the brain become disconnected, logic no longer influences emotions, and that's when you've flipped your lid, right? Yeah. So this can happen more often in someone that has experienced trauma, because they have less capacity to tolerate uncertainty, life stresses, and to stay with difficult feelings. So as well as the flipping the lid analogy, Dan Siegel also devised something called the window of tolerance. So that illustrates how when we're in that window of tolerance, the body, so the nervous system and the brain essentially, is in its optimal state where thoughts and feelings can be accessed and regulated. So from this state, we can effectively function, learn and connect with others. And it's also where resilience lies, which enables us to adapt to changing situations and self-regulate, after life stresses might get in the way. And when someone experiences trauma, particularly if it is prolonged or sustained, this window of tolerance becomes narrower. So then it becomes more difficult to stay in this optimal zone. and also more difficult to get back into it. And this means that their ability to handle, so to tolerate everyday stresses and challenges without becoming overwhelmed or shutting down, is more difficult. And, you know, on top of that, they might also have sort of limited capacity to self-soothe as well. But then I was going to kind of talk a little bit about the autonomic nervous system and how that is affected by trauma. Because as I mentioned before, trauma, you know, can become trapped in our bodies. And part of that is how it affects our nervous system. So the nervous system is managed by the vagus nerve, which is a very large nerve that runs from our brain stem to our stomach. So it connects the brain to the body. And the nervous system has two main branches, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. I said that right. I can never say that right.
You're under pressure.
I know, I've got to say it again in a minute. The central nervous system is essentially the brain and the spinal cord, and then everything else is the peripheral nervous system. There is then the autonomic branch running off the peripheral nervous system, which is responsible for the involuntary functions of the body. So we're talking about things like breathing, digestion, heart beating, swallowing, for example. And then within the autonomic nervous system, there are then two branches, the sympathetic branch, which is known as the fight and flight, and then the parasympathetic branch, which is known as rest and digest. So then I'm going to complicate things a little bit further.
Okay.
And introduce you to the, introduce you to the polyvagal theory. But I'm guessing, are you both kind of aware of that in the work that you do? Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, we're nodding and no one can hear us a podcast. We need to relax.
I can see it.
I really need to keep saying yes or something like that, because me and Abby are so in tune to this. I keep looking at you and you're just nodding, and I'm like, I'm going to say yes in a minute.
Sorry, yes.
Podcast requires us to speak. I think we need to remember that bit.
Yes, remembering to speak. That's always helps. I thought you obviously would be, because it obviously relates a lot to kind of neurodevelopmental conditions, as well as kind of the trauma aspect. But I think it's just useful for everybody to kind of understand it, really.
Yeah,
and
it really is.
Yeah, I think the names of it scare people a little bit as well, because I think if you said to polyvagal theory to someone, they'd be like, what?
100%. And also, absolutely, and all the different branches as well. So it is quite, and the thing is as well, I think it would be really helpful. I mean, anyone can kind of go and Google it, just Google kind of polyvagal theory or the nervous system, whatever, and there will be kind of diagrams kind of available, because I'll always use that within counselling, so there's visual kind of elements to it, and I think that's then easier to understand. But it's just all the different big names, isn't it, for it? But so it was developed by a neuroscientist and psychologist called Dr. Stephen Porges, and it basically helps us to understand how our body and brain work together to respond to stresses that are part of everyday life, as well as the experiences such as trauma. And there are three main branches of the autonomic nervous system. So the optimal branch to be in is called the ventral vagal, but it's also called the social engagement response. And when we're in this nervous system state is when we feel safe, we feel connected to ourselves and others, we feel relaxed, at ease and grounded. And when we're in this state, this is a good place to make decisions from. And then that then correlates with the window of tolerance I mentioned earlier, as when someone has been through trauma, this optimal branch of the nervous system is more kind of difficult to stay in and get back into. And then we have something called neuroception that scans the environment, other people and our own body for cues of safety and danger. As these cues come in, the nervous system then instantly shifts into one of the three states to manage the situation. And in the case of a real impending threat, obviously it kind of optimizes the chance of survival. So the fight or flight response, which is the sympathetic branch of the nervous system, and it is also known as the hyperarousal state, but the fight or flight response is not just activated due to a traumatic event. It can be activated in day-to-day situations, very much like the exam example that you gave, Abby, earlier. But, so it could be, a test of some sort, could be starting school for the first time, starting a new job. It might be kind of a disagreement even with somebody, the pressure of having a massive to-do list and no time, children screaming at each other like mine do all the time. That's when my fight or flight kind of kicks in. It just basically is absolutely anything in which you feel a bit out of control and a bit overwhelmed. And even though there's no real danger in these circumstances, our body and brain perceives it as a threat in some way, and we then don't feel safe in some way, or as I said, kind of out of control. And that is completely normal. We all need that to a certain degree. It's helpful. It does, it drives us thinking again about the exam situation. If we were all a bit la-di-da relaxed, we probably wouldn't kind of perform our best. Whereas, that certain level of kind of adrenaline and, the adrenaline's kicked in, there's a bit of anxiety around it. It does kind of, it does serve its purpose, and we need it.
Yeah, so there's that good stress element, isn't there? And the when it
Absolutely.
becomes too much, but a little bit of stress can be good for you because it can motivate.
Absolutely. Yeah, it does. It kind of, because otherwise we'd be just too relaxed about every situation. Obviously, particularly when you've kind of been through trauma, that will be heightened. And so you might spend more time in that place, which, in itself can be quite exhausting, really. But when you're in that fight or flight response, physically, you will notice that your breathing might become faster, and then we find it hard to think, and we might act impulsively. So that is when we might flip our lid. So we don't have access to rational, logical thoughts. And other things you might notice physically is that our heart rate will soar, the adrenaline is coursing through us, we start to feel fidgety, hypervigilant, our pupils actually become wider in order to kind of scan the environment for danger. And we might feel jittery or hold tension, particularly in our jaw and kind of upper part of the body. And then emotions wise, it could be frustration, anger, fear, panic, anxiety, worry. But it's termed mobilization in polyvagal theory because it's our body's way of preparing to fight the threat or to run away with it, run away from it rather. So, whether or not that is a real threat or a perceived threat. So that's fight or flight. And then there's the freeze or collapse response, when the body does the opposite and it immobilizes it shuts down. And that's known as the dorsal vagal branch of the nervous system, or the hypoarousal state. So just like the fight or flight nervous system response, people will have their own triggers as to what shifts them into that shutdown response. So it tends to be activated when we feel helpless, we feel powerless, we have that sense of shame, despairing, hopeless, kind of emotions like that. Or it might actually be that your system's been in fight or flight for so long, and if that person is unable to self-regulate into the optimal calm zone, the ventral vagal, it then shifts itself into the freeze state to kind of conserve some amount of energy, really. But in this state, our body shuts down and we feel numb and we feel disconnected from ourselves, from other people and our surroundings. And we feel really a bit like a zombie, and we might dissociate. Our emotions are shut down at this point. And in actual fact, our endorphins that numb pain actually increase, which then means the threshold for pain increases. And then physical changes might include slowed speech or missing responses. You might feel quite sleepy. We become less aware of noise or voices around us, and we almost kind of zone them out. So the three states, the ventral vagal, the sympathetic, and the dorsal vagal, aren't entirely separate, but they're more of a continuum that we move through. And that's sort of more often than not on a daily basis. And for people that have experienced trauma, they might find that they spend more time in the fight, flight, or freeze responses due to triggers, and generally not feeling as safe as someone who hasn't experienced significant trauma. And a person who has gone through trauma may find it more difficult to get back into that optimal calm state. But the idea of this theory, though, is if you can understand your own nervous system states a bit more, the sensations, the physical sensations and emotions that come with the fluctuation of these, perhaps even kind of get to know your triggers for going into fight, flight, or freeze, then you can better manage and cope in daily life. I've kind of come to understand that I kind of almost have a default state. So when I'm not in that optimal calm place, my default is to go into that fight or flight state, so that sympathetic branch. Because I often get quite anxious about everything that has to be done and there not being enough time, and I'm sure lots of people can relate to that feeling. And then I feel the anxiety rising and sometimes even getting into a bit of a panic about it. And I also find that I get sort of frustrated quite easily if I'm unable to do something or understand something, because that then gives me the sense of being out of control of a situation. And obviously there isn't any real danger on a day-to-day basis, and nothing dramatic is going to happen if I don't get my to-do list done. But my nervous system doesn't necessarily know this, so it still responds in the same way as though there was a real threat. And then there might be other life stressors that get in the way that impact our nervous system. And actually, incidentally, mine was kind of triggered into fight or flight again last week, and I thought, amazing, because I can use this. Example. I saw the silver lining of it, but it was I finished work and wandered over to my car, and I had a lovely yellow parking ticket.
Oh no.
Which I have to interject and say I was failed by the technology app. But anyway, I just hate being in any sort of kind of trouble. I mean, no one likes seeing that yellow ticket. And obviously that goes back to like my own experiences, you know, and in that very moment, I kind of go back to being a child again, and my nervous system does as well. So I sat in my car for about 10 minutes and I was a little bit confused, a little bit panicked, and then blamed myself, you know, for not double checking the parking had gone through. But then I thought, right, okay, how am I going to change this around? And I started to regulate my nervous system by kind of breathing and then kind of looking out of the window and focusing on certain objects, and then I kind of subsequently kind of felt okay to continue my day. And then sort of by the time I'd, you know, driven home, you know, I found that actually my mindset had changed, and I just thought, well, I'll just appeal it and see what happens, which is what I've done. So we will wait and hear whether I have to pay that £25 or not.
Yeah.
It's just good to sort of have those examples, I think, sort of real life day-to-day examples of when your nervous system, you know, is affected. And this is, you know, this is life, isn't it? You know, this is trauma aside, we all have those things probably on a daily basis that do kind of send our nervous systems into overdrive a little bit. But I don't know whether kind of either of you can think of any kind of, you know, triggers, or kind of whether do you identify kind of more with going into the fight or flight, or is it more kind of going into a freeze response? Or
where do we start, Abby?
Where do we start? I mean, I think I become quite vocal when I go into this fight. So like you, Victoria, I like to be organised, and I like to have, particularly at work, home life is a very different matter, but at work, because I don't like to get into trouble, is I have to have everything sorted, in place, meet the deadlines. And if I feel like it's building up, and I'm sure Natalie will join in here, is I become very vocal and I just have to go and tell her, because I get like a bit flappy, and I'm like, I know it will be fine, but I need to tell someone so I can then get
Yeah,
on with it.
Victoria being an
yeah.
avid listener, she'll know about Eat the Frog and the Freddos now.
I
Yeah.
do. I
Yeah.
absolutely do. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm a bit like that, and I think it was quite funny the other day. Chelsea, my manager, turned around to me and she went, Natalie, you do realise at work you'll never not have a to-do list. You'll never complete your to-do list, because that's what the idea of working. And it kind of hit me, and I went, oh yeah, like I'm always going to have something on my to-do list, because I'm a person a bit like you, Abby. Like, I like to complete things and have
Yeah.
it done. And yeah, she turned around to me the other day and went, "You're never not going to have something on your to-do list." And I was like, "Oh yeah, you're so
Yeah.
right there."
Yeah.
Wait.
It's funny you say that, actually, because my clinical supervisor said exactly the same thing to me the other day. You're
Yeah,
always going to have a to-do list, so actually you still need to take that time,
Yeah.
for
yeah.
yourself, because nothing's going to change, is it?
No.
No,
If you
I just
complete your list,
yeah.
that's the end of work.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can think of a really funny situation actually where, and it's one of those situations where you're like, why is my brain or my body reacting how it is? Because it was a little while ago, we did, I don't know if anyone knows, but I've got horses outside of work, and my mum and myself did an equine event, and it had several other people there, and it was like a professional and things like that. And we the place we used had a set of rules of like what you could or couldn't do within the school that we were using. And we went into one of the sessions, and I couldn't remember the rules like for Abdom. I knew there was a rough guide of what I could or couldn't do. And we kind of flicked and started doing something that I didn't think we were allowed to do. I spent an hour literally thinking, we're going to get told off. I don't want to get in trouble. Oh my God, what's going to happen? They're not going to let us come back. And it was like horrible for an hour. I couldn't listen to whatever the trainer was saying, because I was spending so much time worrying about the potential outcome, rather than doing what you did, Victoria, and just going, okay, I can deal with this, we'll deal with it afterwards. I spent an hour on the edge of my seat and I took nothing in because I was so worried at what potentially the outcome was going to be.
Well, that's interesting. So we're all similar in that respect then.
Yeah. Yeah. Whereas my brother will go to sleep in situations that make him stressed. I mean, he gets overwhelmed in like family events, and like there's lots of people around. You'll often find him just asleep on the chair in the corner, and you go, okay, what's happened there? But I think that's just his way of coping. It's too much, so I'm just gonna
So that's
almost,
really interesting. So his default is the kind of free shut
yeah,
down, isn't it? And actually
yeah,
does that by going to sleep. Yeah, that's
yeah.
really
He has
interesting.
a little nap. I
He has
wish
a
I
little
did.
nap.
Could you
I know.
imagine at work? I turn around to Chelsea and go, I'm overwhelmed, my to-do list too much. Okay, I'm gonna
I'm
have a
going
nap.
into flop mode. It's
Yeah. Yeah, maybe we should try that one. And then a resource around the impact of trauma is Caroline Spring's website, which just has so much on kind of understanding and recovering from trauma. And she is a survivor herself. So that's just carolinespring.com. But yeah, just in case anyone's sort of interested in learning a little bit more.
Amazing. Okay, so we've reached a point where we're going to pause our interview with Victoria now, otherwise it would have been quite a long episode. We've covered kind of like the core composites of trauma and where it could stem from, and our next episode, which is also going to be live now, is going to cover the strategies that you can do to support yourself if you've experienced any trauma, and also how to support some loved ones. As we've previously said, if you do need support and help, we will signpost you links within the comments and the description so that you can get the support you need. If you would like to, on a brighter note, contact us. You can email us at thesensationallife@bibic.org.uk. Maybe send us in some of those glimmers.
Oh,
We'd
I
love
love
to
the
hear your
glimmers.
glimmers. I
I
know
love
it's such a
your
lovely
glimmers, Abby.
concept, isn't it?
Yeah, I really loved your glimmer though, Abby, as well, about the sunlight. I think
I
that's,
know.
yeah.
Nothing quite like it, I don't think.
No, that was really lovely, wasn't it?
Yeah, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram. And if you wanted to look up Bibic and any of the services that we can offer, if you wanted that sound number, that support and advice line that Natalie mentioned earlier, you can just Google Bibic and it will come up with our website.
Amazing. So, as we always end these podcasts, if you are listening and just about to jump straight into the strategies podcast, fair play to you, because this is some core information right now. But also, if you're taking a break, we totally get it, because we did 2 hours straight and it's a
And
really interesting topic. And as we always end our podcast now, once again, keep it sensational.